6 months after the green light closed over Hive Tertius, Inquisitor Kael Mordane kept the wound open. That was how he thought of it. Privately, when the quarantine bureaucracy asked him for the 4th time to certify the Sumpgate district as inert and formally close the case. Not the physical scar that remained. A cratered, scorched bite cut out of the Hive's western edge, still too hot for civilian reclamation, and officially attributed to residual contamination of unknown origin. The wound Mordane kept was procedural. He had filled the district with watch stations, servo skull pickets, grav shackle emplacements, void shield scaffoldings, and null collars enough to restrain a conclave of rogue psychers, and he had left the whole apparatus humming on standby, week after week, month after month, waiting for something that had given no sign of returning. His seal sat on the appendix that said, "Observe first, engage second, pray always." His had been the only voice arguing against the High Lord's instinct to weaponize the anomaly or to bury it entirely. And his was the file that kept coming back from Terra, marked reopened by no one in particular, because Kael Mordane had spent too many centuries hunting the things that lived in humanity's blind spots to believe that a door which had opened once with that much deliberate precision would not open again. The arrival, when it came at Sumpgate 12. The exact coordinates. The exact seam of green-white light, tearing the ash-gray sky in exactly the same motion, as if reality itself were folding along a crease it had already learned. One moment, the district was empty, scaffolding and dust. The next, the air was splitting, spilling clean, cold radiance down into the crater, and every alarm Mordane had planted in the rubble went off at once. "Target confirmed," crackled Magos. Logister Hest across the command net, his voice woven through with binary static, and the particular tonal quality Mordane had learned to recognize as genuine machine apprehension. "Transit signature matches the previous event to 7/1000ths of a standard deviation, Inquisitor. This gate is not random." "Nothing about this was ever random," Mordane said. He was already moving toward the command blister's viewing slit, tabard trailing through soot, one hand resting on the rosette at his throat as if the old metal could anchor him the way scripture anchored lesser men. The containment protocol they had drilled 40 times, and never once used deployed in 11 seconds. Grav shackles hummed to life, laying overlapping fields of crushing weight across the crater floor. Void shield generatoria crawled into position on tracked chassis, their shimmering fields rising like heat haze over oil. 70 stormtroopers in black carapace took firing arcs among the ruins. Hell guns charged, trigger fingers aching with the strain of not yet firing. And above it all, suspended on a cradle of lost-locked cables, a null collar the size of a habdor descended toward the crater like a crown of denial, tuned to smother whatever psychic signature its victim possessed before that signature could smother the Hive. The Slayer landed in his own crater, at the center of the net, and stood. Same armor, same dull, battle-scarred green, same silence. He did not look up at the collar. He did not look at the stormtroopers. He looked at the nearest grav shackle the way a man looks at a locked door, with the certainty that the door was only an opinion. Then he moved. The first field simply failed. Mordane saw the runes on the Slayer's pauldron flare once, a dull ember glow beneath the grime, and the crushing gravity that should have flattened him folded around the green armor like water around a stone. The Slayer walked through the dead zone, reached the second emitter, and tore it out of its rockcrete footing with his hands. He hurled it into the third shackle hard enough to wreck both in a shower of sparks and torn plasteel, and the sound of it rolled across the district like a struck gong. The null collar was still descending when the Slayer looked up, finally, and acknowledged it. He launched himself skyward. The command blister's picked feed struggled for a beat to track him, met the collar in midair, and drove it up into its own cradle. Cables snapped one after another. The entire apparatus crashed down behind him in 3 pieces. A broken crown. Still not one stormtrooper dead. Not one seriously wounded. The Slayer moved through the arcs of aimed fire without ever seeming to register them, taking rifles out of gloved hands and tossing them aside. 1, 2, 3, before the troopers finished comprehending that their weapons were gone. He knocked a charging sergeant sideways with an open palm. Not hard enough to break bone, hard enough to demonstrate that everything in this district had been declared, by him, suddenly unimportant. This was not a breakout, Mordane understood, watching from the slit. This was a statement. The Slayer was here for something, and the Inquisition was not it. Then Brother Captain Roth's kill team hit the deck. 5 black giants dropped from gunships that had come in low and quiet, landing with enough thunder to shake dust from the scaffolds. Cassian, Nemd, Severin, Hakon, and Merrick, the same 5 who had chased this quarry through the Underhive 6 months before and walked away with dented armor and a worse education. Bolters leveled, power weapons humming. The sight of them, even through the haze, made the surviving stormtroopers relax a fraction. Because here at last were things big enough to matter. The Slayer turned. He stopped moving, unhurried, and looked at the Deathwatch. For one long moment, neither side moved. Merrick's bolter rose a degree. "This time, alien filth!" "Stand down," Routh said. The order was quiet. It carried anyway. "Inquisitorial protocol is capture, brother, Captain," Merrick said. And the words were not a question so much as a religious object being held up for inspection. "The Inquisitor wants him intact," Routh said. "More intact than we managed last time. Hold fire." "You cannot cage a thing you cannot even see move," Hakon muttered, almost warmly, and Mordane heard, under the humor, the thing Hakon was actually saying. "Do not make me fight that alone again." The Slayer, for his part, had stopped paying attention to the Deathwatch. He was looking at the sky. Mordane's gaze followed his. For a moment, nothing. Ash-gray clouds. The distant smear of the Hive's eternal fires. The faint green afterimage of the gate that had already sealed behind the newcomer. Then every vox in the district screamed at once, drowning in overlapping catastrophe beacons, and Hest's voice came through the avalanche of static with a single, terrible clarity. "Orbital contact. Mass signature off the scale. They're on a collision trajectory, directly onto Sump Gate 12. Mordane had time to think. Of course. The door had not opened by accident. And the door had not opened for the Inquisition. The door had opened for an audience. The sky tore open a second time, and this time, the light was not green. It was red. What came through the red light did not arrive so much as occur, the way a wound occurs as a sudden rearrangement of what was already there. The mass signature resolved itself into ships. Not Imperial. Not Xenos in any catalog sense. Vessels of rust-black iron that seemed to have been grown rather than built. Their hulls set with cyclopean lenses burning with a light that hurt the mind the way a shout hurt the ear, their prows carved into open mouths lined with teeth of riveted adamantium. They descended in perfect silence. That was the first wrongness, the one every veteran on the wall noticed at once. A warp-capable fleet translating into a planet's atmosphere should have screamed across every auger in the sector. These ships came down like held breath, like a sermon about to begin, and the only sound anywhere in Hive Tertius was the frightened pounding of hearts. There were no gunfire exchanges. There was no orbital bombardment. The ships simply hung over Sump Gate 12 in a loose corona, their cyclopean lenses turning, one by one, until every single one of them was aimed at the crater where the Slayer stood. "Identify them," Mordane said. Hest's reply came in pieces. because his cogitator banks were devouring data and regurgitating fragments of older archives scraped out of the sector's deepest vaults. Iconography matches a fragmentary doctrinal current, the Ordo Malleus catalogued as extinct 1100 years ago, Inquisitor. They called themselves the Choir of the Unborn, a pre-imperial death cult of the Deep Warp. Our records contain 4 confirmed appearances, all apocalyptic, all sealed. Unborn, Mordane repeated. Unborn what? Their liturgy refers to a singular entity, Hest said, and his voice flickered with something close to unease. A god that never finished being born, older than the Ruinous Four by their own claim, sleeping at the bottom of the Imperium. They call it the Unborn. And Inquisitor, their old texts, describe an apocalypse in which the Unborn does not wake on its own. The apocalypse is the one where it is carried across the threshold of reality in something living. Mordane went very still. He looked at the Slayer, standing motionless in the crater, and he looked at the corona of rust-black ships arranging themselves in a circle whose center was that same crater, and the understanding arrived in his chest like a cold blade. They didn't invade, he said quietly. They collected. Governor Selvin, who had been silent since the red light opened, found his voice with visible effort. Collected who? Mordane did not answer. He was already giving new orders into the Vox. Abandon the containment protocols, retask every heavy weapon on the perimeter toward the ships, scramble the few interceptors they still possessed, and get the civilians out of the lower hive faster than the Administratum had ever moved anything. Because the pattern had resolved itself, and the pattern was this. The first green tier 6 months ago had not been a natural breach, and the Slayer had not been a random castaway. He had been fished. The Choir's entire doctrine, their whole history of apocalyptic flare-ups across 11 centuries, had apparently been one long attempt to find a creature capable of carrying a dimensional mark without being consumed by it. A soul that existed outside the cycle of the warp, a constant. And something in the red light made it sickeningly clear they had finally found one. The first ship began to sing. It was not a sound anyone chose to hear. It arrived in the bones before the ears. A subsonic thrum pitched below grief, below fear, below any emotion the human nervous system had a name for. Then a second ship joined it, and a third. And the repair yards and the hab stacks and the ancient cathedral keeps of Hive Tertius began to resonate like struck glass. Cracks ran through rockcrete. Servo skulls dropped dead from the air. In the lower districts, whole blocks of workers stopped moving, eyes turned skyward, mouths hanging open, caught by the cord the way flies are caught by light. Where the cord flowed thickest, wards painted on shrine doors began to peel away on their own. The White's chorus, the choir's song, was not an attack. It was a key turning in a lock, and the lock was the crater. What is the entity doing? Mordane demanded, watching the pict feed of the Slayer. The Slayer had not moved through the entire transit of the fleet. He stood in the crater with his head tilted, the way a hunting animal tilts its head when it finally places a scent. Then, unhurried, he reached down and picked up a fist-sized shard of the original impact, a wedge of matter that had been fused to glass by the Green Gate's passage weeks before. The choir even arrived and crushed it in his gauntlet. Black powder ran through his fingers. He looked at his palm. The runes on his armor pulsed once, twice, in the same rhythm as the ship's song. He's not fighting it, Routh had observed, from where he had withdrawn his kill team to the rim of the district. He's taking it apart. Taking what apart? Asked Selvin. Their assumptions, Mordane said, and suddenly understood exactly what the Slayer was doing. The choir's song was a question, a probe, a diagnostic it was feeling for the shape of the soul it had fished across reality, reaching for the mark it had spent centuries learning to recognize. and the Slayer was answering it, not with obedience, with violence. Every pulse of his armor's runes was a countersignal, a corrupting echo, a spoiler thrown into their triangulation. The song stuttered. Two of the lenses dimmed. For an instant, the cord wavered, and in that instant, the Slayer launched himself straight up out of the crater, faster than any of the picked feeds could hold, and punched the nearest ship. The vessel was the size of a frigate. It had been designed to survive re-entry, void war, and the attention of things that lived in the space between stars. It did not survive the punch. The hull buckled inward, along a line that ran the entire length of the keel. The cyclopean lenses shattered in sequence, and the ship began to fall, trailing fire, straight into the lower hive. It came apart on the way down. Daemons spilled out of the wreckage, not with howls, but in silence, angular and wrong. Their bodies made of edges that hurt to look at. Their faces smooth where faces should have been. They fell like rain onto the habstacks, and the true invasion began. What followed was the longest night in the history of Charon's Reach, and by morning the survivors would describe it in ways that contradicted each other because the enemy they fought did not obey the rules their minds had been built to process. The choir's daemons did not shriek. They did not rage. They did not even seem to want. They moved through the smoke-black streets of Hive Tertius with a terrible patience, and where they passed, sound died. Gunfire became muffled. Shouts became whispers. Men looked at their own weapons as if they had forgotten the point of them. The daemons did not feast, and they did not gloat. They simply subtracted, walking through a company's fortification line and leaving behind, in the place of 40 screaming soldiers, 40 still shapes that had already forgotten what screaming was for. Mordane's psychers were the second line of defense, and they died first. The choir's presence was not an assault on the mind. It was a removal of the mind's authority, a silence that made psychic power simply fail to occur, the way water fails to freeze in a warm room. The null collars Mordane had built for the Slayer were repurposed within the hour into the only weapons that could touch the invading daemons. But every null in the hive was worth less than one green armored figure who kept appearing wherever the silence was thickest and breaking it with his fists. The Deathwatch kill team fought beside him without orders, which surprised everyone except Mordane. Merrick, the Black Templar, had refused at first, had actually turned his back and moved to reinforce the eastern wall alone. But the silence found him there, and what followed was the nearest thing to a miracle Merrick would ever admit to witnessing. The Slayer came out of a burning manufactorum, took the daemon that had been about to strip Merrick's faith out through his ears, and tore it into 4 pieces with his hands, then stood over the Black Templar for a moment, waiting. While the surviving daemons receded, Merrick got to his feet in the sudden ringing quiet, looked the Slayer in the faceplate, and said nothing. He did not thank. He did not refuse. He simply picked up his bolter and moved into position on the Slayer's flank, and from that moment, the Black Templar fought beside the green thing, as if the Emperor had personally issued the order. Hakon laughed his way through the whole night. It was the wild, unhinged laughter of a space wolf who has found a brother in a place he never expected. He and the Slayer crossed paths 3 times in the burning streets, and each time Hakon watched the Slayer do something impossible, crush a daemon engine's spine with a single blow, catch a possessed war machinery in mid-lunge, and fold it backward around a support pillar. Punch through the smooth, faceless skull of a choir daemon with enough force to silence the silence itself, and each time Hakon laughed louder. When the Slayer saved Cassian from a blade of solidified stillness that had been about to take the Ultramarine's head, Hakon was there to haul Cassian upright and say, with genuine warmth, "Brother, I believe our new friend likes you better than I do." Nimd did not laugh. Nimd measured. Every exchange between the Slayer and the choir was logged to his armor's memory banks. every counter-rhythm of the armor's runes cataloged and cross-referenced, and what emerged from the data in the gray hours before dawn was the single most important tactical fact of the entire invasion. The entity is not merely resistant to the choir's influence, Nemed voxed to the command blister. He is actively resonant. Each counter-signal from his armor produces a measurable attenuation in the local manifestation field. Where he fights, the silence thins. He is functioning as a null of extreme efficiency, a living negation of the choir's doctrine. Mordane stared at the reading for a long moment. He didn't fall here, he said aloud, testing the shape of it. He was fished. But the hook is a hook in a river that hates fishermen. Whatever the choir wanted to catch, they have dragged up something that their own god has been fleeing, across every reality it has ever touched. Fleeing? Hest asked. Think, Magos. They call him one thing in their liturgies, the Unborn, call him the little slayer of their children. Our own records from the first incursion describe him hunting demons across dimensions with a fury so focused, it reads, as a law of nature. The choir did not choose him because he was convenient, Inquisitor. They chose him because he is the one thing in all of creation that has never once lost to their kind. The revelation cracked open a second understanding, and it arrived in the command blister through a different channel entirely. Interrogator Julia Vex, Arbitrator Vase's replacement in the intelligence rotation, a slight woman with a voice like a filing cabinet, had been running the choir's recovered fragments through the ancient purgation liturgies of the Ordo Malleus, and what she found made her go white. She brought the data slate to Mordane with both hands, as if it were hot, and when he read it, he understood what Hest had not yet dared to say aloud. It's not a coincidence, Mordane said very softly. The first gate, the second gate, the crater, the seam. He laid the slate down and looked out at the burning hive, where the red light had begun, impossibly, to thicken at the horizon, as if the sky were clotting. The choir did not open the door. They tuned a bell that was already there. The seam beneath Sumpgate 12 has been thinning for 10,000 years. This world was chosen before the Imperium ever claimed it. And the Slayer, he could barely make himself say it, because saying it made it true. The Slayer was fished across the rift, so that the Unborn would have a key that actually fit. Outside, the song changed. For 6 hours it had been a chord, a held note, a question. Now it became close harmonics, a rise, a beginning. The cyclopean lenses that remained focused their light into a single beam that struck the crater's heart, and the beam did not scatter. It pooled. It gathered. It became a vertical slit of red radiance standing in the crater, and behind the slit, in the way a shape is visible behind frosted glass, something immense was moving, waking, coming up out of a depth that predated the stars. And the Slayer, who had been fighting for hours without pause, stopped in the middle of the street, turned his head toward the beam, and began to walk toward it. The Deathwatch knew the shape of what was happening before Mordane did. Roth voxed once, flat and final. He's going in. There was no question about what in meant. The Slayer had found the wound, and the wound had found him, and the only thing either of them knew how to do with the other was to close. The choir's host opened around him like water. Daemons of the silence poured out of every shadow and every broken window to block his path, and the Slayer went through them the way a story goes through paper. He did not slow. He did not waste a single movement on anything that was not directly between him and the beam. Fists struck. Bodies came apart. The silence screamed once, badly. When a daemon whose face had been a smooth, empty plane finally got a face, the shape of his fist, and then stopped being anything at all. Behind him, hacking through the tide with chainsword and power blade, came the Deathwatch, and Mordane's stormtroopers, and a thin, ragged line of Imperial defenders. who had seen the Green Warrior refuse to stop and found, in that refusal, a reason not to stop themselves. Hakan reached the crater rim first, laughing through a broken Vox grill, and hurled himself at the flank of the choir's rear guard. Merrick followed in silence and fury. Cassian covered Neemed, while the Iron Hands brother planted a brace of crack charges against the sealed base of the nearest lens array. Roth reached the Slayer's shoulder as the Green Warrior stepped to the edge of the beam, and for 3 full seconds the two of them stood together, the captain of the Deathwatch and the thing his order had been sent to capture, looking into the red slit together. "What is it?" Routh said. "Not a question, a confirmation." The answer arrived in both their minds at once, cold and vast, arriving not through the warp but underneath it. A voice that was the absence of voice, a word that was the absence of words, speaking in a language older than the gods, because it had been there before there were gods to have languages. "Little slayer of my children." The beam rippled. In the slit, the shape gathered itself, an eye beginning to open at the center of a face that had not finished being imagined. "You have tended my garden for me," it said. "Across 1,000 realities, you have pruned what was weak and gathered what was strong, and I have dreamed you the whole way, the way a blade dreams of its wielder. Every demon you burned, I tasted through you. Every hell you emptied, I filled my belly with. You did not fight my children. You fed me my children, and I am almost whole because of it." The Slayer stood motionless at the edge of the beam. His hands, which had not stopped moving for 6 hours, were still. The red light slid over the scarred green armor, like water over a stone. "You crossed when I called," the voice continued, with something that might have been terrible amusement. "You always cross when I call. All I had to do was build a war loud enough to sound like prey, and the hunter came. The Red Hand, the crater, the seam, this world, all of it was the bell. And you, little slayer, are the clapper. When the choir bind you in the heart of the seam and open you the way a man opens a door, I will not wake into this galaxy as a god. I will wake into this galaxy as you." That was the ritual's true shape. Not to destroy the Slayer, not to consume him. To use the one soul in all of creation that existed outside the warp cycle as a bridge to be carried into reality inside him, the way a passenger is carried inside a ship. The choir's red light was not a cage. It was a womb, and the Slayer was the seed. And the Unborn's entire eternal war against him, every daemon he had ever slaughtered across every dimension, had been the courtship. For a long moment, the only sound in the world was the beating of blood in the ears of the living. Then Merrick voxed, quietly, to the whole net, "I will die before I let it." And the Slayer raised his right hand. It was not a complicated gesture. It was not even especially violent. He simply closed his fist and drove it into the beam at the point where it met the air, not at the lens, not at the ships above, but at the seam itself, the place where the red light became the shape behind the slit. The runes on his armor flared to full brilliance, a green so pure it made the red light look like a wound, and for one impossible instant, the Slayer's fist went through the beam, as if the beam were a door, and punched the Unborn in the mouth. The slit screamed. Every lens in the sky shattered at once. The ships lurched, collided, began to fall. The chant of the choir, the chant that had kept the seam open, broke apart into 10,000 individual voices, shrieking in 10,000 different directions, because the silence that had united them had suddenly become something they had to flee from. Below, in the crater, the red slit tore down the middle, and the shape behind it, half-born, unfinished, roaring, was dragged back into the depth it had crawled out of, trailing shards of its own impossibility, like burning burial cloth. But it did not go silently. The last thing it said, before the seam sealed, traveled along the dying light and into every mind on the field at once, and every one of them would hear it in their dreams for the rest of their lives. You struck the mother of the door, little Slayer. But I have your rhythm now. I have carried the sound of your heart in my belly for 1,000,000 years. When I return, and I will return, I will not wake inside you. I will wake around you. And then, to Mordane alone, because it had been listening, because it had always been listening. Keep him safe for me, Inquisitor. He is the only child I have left. The red light died. The ships burned where they fell. The sky over Hive Tertius returned, slowly, to its ordinary ash gray as the sun clawed its way back over the horizon. And the survivors began, in the stunned silence of the newly living, to take stock of what the longest night had cost them. Hive Tertius had lost 3 districts, 2 manufactura mezzanines, and 11,000 souls to stillness. The choir of the Unborn had lost everything it had spent 11 centuries gathering, and the Unborn itself had been denied ITS manifestation. By any measure the Imperium used, it was a victory. Clean, complete, total. Mordane stood at the edge of the crater as the morning came up, and watched the Slayer walk the perimeter of the wound, the way a man walks the perimeter of a grave. The Green Warrior had not looked up at him once. He had not acknowledged the Deathwatch, who had fought beside him for 8 hours and seen him do impossible things. He stopped at the northern edge of the crater, where the ground still shimmered faintly with residual red radiance, and stood there long enough that Mordane began to wonder if he was waiting for something. Then the green light began to open above him, the Slayer's own gate. The door that had brought him, the door that had taken him home the last time. It flickered into being and stopped, stuttered, tangled. The familiar clean seam faltered halfway through its opening, and out of the wrinkled place where it failed, something dark and vast pressed against the inside of the sky, the way a face presses against a window, and Mordane heard it again, quietly, intimately, in the exact center of his skull. I have your rhythm now. The green light died. The gate sealed itself, or was sealed by something else, and the Slayer remained on the scorched northern rim of the crater, still and immense, watching the place where his way home had been. The seam was no longer a door. It was a window, and the Unborn denied manifestation. Denied the bridge had settled in to watch through it, patient as a mother, hungry as a child, with all the time in the universe, and all the patience of something that had never once finished being born. Mordane stood beside the hulking figure of the Green Warrior, and did not know what to say. He had spent 6 months trying to cage it, hours fighting beside it, and the rest of his life he understood now, with a clarity that felt like hemlock would be spent trying to keep it alive, because it was no longer a weapon and no longer a threat. It was a key, and there was something on the other side of the door that had been reaching for it since before the first fire of the first world kindled. It had called the Slayer its child. It had called him its hunter and its harvest, and its last remaining memory of the time before the gods. And it had promised, in the exact tone of a thing that had never once broken a vow, that it would come back for him. The Slayer stood at the edge of the crater, under a dim and hostile sun, in a galaxy that was not his, and for the first time in his eternal war he did not advance, because, for the first time, he was not sure which of them was the hunter, and which of them had just been brought home. Behind him, the Voxnets were already filling with traffic casualty reports, salvage claims, inquisitorial orders stretched thin across a wounded sector, the ordinary grinding machinery of an Imperium that had survived another night and would spend the next one preparing to survive the next. But Mordane barely heard it. He was reading the augur banks one more time, the way he had read them 6 months ago, and he was finding the same pattern in the data that Hest had been too polite to point out and Vex had been too pale to say. The choir's arrival had not been the beginning. The Unborn had sealed the Slayer's door, trapping him here on purpose. And somewhere in the deep warp, at the bottom of the depth where even the Ruinous Powers did not go, something that predated them all was slowly, carefully, lovingly arranging the universe so that when it returned, its child would be right where it had left him. Mordane looked at the Green Warrior, still standing at the rim of the wound, still watching the sky. "Welcome to the Imperium, little Slayer," he said, very quietly, to no one and to everyone. "Emperor, have mercy on us all." And far below the threshold of hearing, far below the threshold of thought, in the place where the warp forgot to be important, the Unborn opened one eye, an eye the size of a moonless sky, and began, at last, to smile.